So behavior modification is the application of learning principles to change and affect behavior. So in our toolkit, we have both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Both of these can be used for behavior mods. When we use operant techniques to change behavior, we are using a token economy, which is simply reinforcing behavior. If we had at-risk youth, we wanted to target certain behaviors like thank you and please. We would simply give them a certain indicator, maybe some kind of token system. We wouldn't want to give them money every single time, but maybe we give them chips, and they get 10 chips at the end of the week, then they can play video games or they can do something fun. Timeout is a behavioral modification. You're probably familiar with the concept. This uses extinction. So if a certain behavior is reinforcing negative behavior, if a certain something is reinforcing negative behavior, kid stands up and kids laugh, we remove them from that class, or we remove the people that are laughing and reinforcing that behavior. That would be a type of timeout. Applied behavioral analysis is also known as shaping. So shaping is incorporating small steps. Here you have a cat being trained to use the toilet. You wouldn't start by putting the cat on the toilet. You'd start by putting the cat on the litter box. You would find something the cat really enjoys. Every time they use the litter box, they are reinforced with effective reinforcement. Then simply you would do heavily reinforcement early on, and then you back off. Once they are successfully using and frequently using the litter box, you would incorporate harder steps. You would eventually put the litter box on top of the toilet. You would reinforce heavily every time you make a new change, and then you back it off, and eventually you'd cut a hole in the litter box. Again, heavily reinforce and then back off, and then eventually moving the litter box entirely and reinforcing only the cat getting up on the toilet. You'd have to be really motivated, I guess, to get your cat potty trained, but it is possible. And this is just a silly example. This is actually used for complex series of behaviors, oftentimes with certain populations of youth, at-risk youth, residential facilities for the mental retardation, those with developmental delay, and then also in school systems. This is shaping and behavioral analysis is used quite frequently. But we're also seeing probably, I would call, cutting edge usage of behavioral modification. Biofeedback, it's controlling involuntary responses such as blood pressure via biological feedback. So here we would give a person maybe even like a fitness tracker such as a Garmin or a Fitbit, and we would let them see their things like their REM sleep. What kind of REM sleep are they getting? What is their blood pressure, for instance? And then we would teach them relaxation, and we would show them that perhaps they're sleeping better, their heart rate has gone down, so we can give them feedback. These fitness trackers are actually being used quite a lot in there for biofeedback, and I'm a huge fan. But we also have something called neurofeedback. So we can give a person brain scans before therapy and give them therapy, and after we can show them that their brain is improving. I have seen before and after PET scans of those receiving psychological therapy, and this is tremendous, very, very important for a person to see that they're making improvements. They may not necessarily feel a lot better, but you can show them 3 months before and after of a PET scan and show them that they're really making lots of progress. So with cognitive learning, the early days of behaviorism was focused specifically on behavior. Things started to shift in the 50s and 60s with Edward Tolman and other cognitive scientists. Tolman put rats in a maze. He had 3 conditions within this group. The group 1 was reinforced for how fast they went. So as soon as they finished the maze, they would get a reward. Group 3 was never reinforced. And group 2 was the experimental condition, the experimental group. The independent variable was being rewarded halfway through the trial. What they found is in group 2, halfway through the trial, when they started giving rats reinforcement, their times got significantly faster. So they became even faster than group 1. And so Tolman, from this, concluded that they had learned the maze all along. They knew how to go fast through the maze, they just weren't reinforced. And so from this, he just said that learning can occur without performance. And this was an important statement in psychology because behaviorists were saying learning can only be tracked with behavior. So this was a big movement for the study of thoughts. Another cognitive psychologist was Walter Seligman, who would eventually be well known for his positive psychology. But he came up with a concept called learned helplessness from his research with dogs. Learned helplessness is defined as the tendency to fail to act, to escape from a situation because of history of repeated failures. He used dogs, and the floor of this cage was charged with electricity, and the dogs would experience a mild electric shock. And in 2 conditions, in one condition, the dogs were warned with a beep from the speaker. So when they heard the beep, they could learn to jump the hurdle. That was the control group. Now in the experimental group, the dogs received no warning. They were simply shocked. And in this condition, the dogs would simply cower in the corner and learn helplessness. Even later, after they started receiving a warning with a small pulsating sound from the speakers, at that point they still would not learn to jump the hurdle. I've used this analogy with people who remain in abusive relationships. Oftentimes there is a learned helplessness. They have a defeated psychology, if you will. I have a lot of students who have repeated failure in school and therefore never learn that they can learn. But I do have some very positive stories of avoidance learning. Kids learn that, hey, if I don't study for this test, I'll fail. And they can learn that they can learn. And it's smart to be smart. So observational learning brings us to a final famous research study. This is learning new behavior by watching a model. And this brings us to Albert Bandura's classic Bobo doll experiment. Here you have a picture of a young girl, and she's kicking a clown doll. So what's the story behind this? So Bobo doll experiment was one in which aggressive children were in a room with a model, and this person was either aggressive or non-aggressive. So the independent variable group, or the experimental group, were kids, boys and girls, who watched an aggressive model. So the control group were kids who watched a model who did not act aggressively. And the kids, both male and female, who viewed the aggressive model played more aggressively. And these actors at some point took a mallet to hit the Bobo doll, they punched the Bobo doll, and they kicked the Bobo doll, and they walked out of the room and told the kids not to do what they did. The kids who watched the aggressive model were more likely to act aggressively. And this leads us to the question for kids, watching violence on a video game is going to cause them to commit violence. More specifically, I would ask it this way. If a child, male or female, watches violence, are they learning violence? Notice how I posed that question. Are they learning violence? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. Now, whether they will imitate the violence is another question. So let's talk about observational learning. One must do 4 things to imitate a model. You must pay attention. You must hold it in your memory. Here, the learner must be able to retain what was observed. They must imitate this. Learner must be able to reproduce actions of a model. And then finally, the learner must be motivated to reproduce observed behaviors. Learner must be motivated to reproduce. So what creates a violent actor is one who's not just paid attention and memorized, but has imitated. And the imitation is the point at which we start to get concerned. When you have kids who are not just watching violence or sexually destructive videos, which I still would contend that is teaching them those behaviors. But the point at which they start to imitate this, the point at which they have motivation then. So I think that the violent actions come when, not just when life happens. I don't like this term that I hear from my students, something just snapped. I hear it in culture all the time. Things don't just snap. It's a 4-step process. People have to pay attention to the violent media, which we have no shortage of. We have no shortage of sexually reckless behavior portrayed through the media. And not only are we paying attention to that and remembering that as a culture, but at some point, imitation then can happen. And nowadays, people are imitating this simply by writing about it on a blog or putting social media posts out there. And eventually, when they get positive response, they get the response, this becomes motivation for even more destructive behavior. So keep this in mind, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on our discussion board. All right, this concludes part 2. Y'all take care.